A god-king of a billion stars pulled the trigger. A human child fell. In the Galactic Council, it was brushed off as a minor diplomatic inconvenience. On Earth, it was the sounding of the seventh trumpet. They thought we were weak. They were about to learn why humanity keeps its monsters chained. The diplomatic summit on Station Aegis was supposed to be humanity's grand introduction to the wider galactic stage. For a century, Earth had slowly crawled its way out of the solar system, utilizing retrofitted vessels and rudimentary warp drives. We were the new kids on the cosmic block, eager to please, desperate for trade, and acutely aware of our own technological inferiority. Station Aegis was a neutral zone, a massive spinning cathedral of glass and brushed titanium orbiting a dead gas giant in the Sejanus sector. The delegation from Earth was small. Ambassador Adrian Hastings led the group, a seasoned diplomat who had spent his entire career navigating treacherous international politics. With him was his chief engineer, David Rourke, a brilliant but quiet man who had designed the very life support systems keeping the human delegation breathing in the alien atmosphere. And then there was Leo. Leo was David's 8-year-old son. David's wife had passed away 2 years prior, and with no family left to watch the boy during this unprecedented 6-month diplomatic mission, Hastings had pulled the necessary strings to bring Leo along. The boy was a favorite among the delegation, a bright-eyed, energetic reminder of exactly what humanity was fighting for in the dark void of space. The undisputed masters of the galaxy were the Valthorian Ascendancy. They were humanoids, towering 7 feet tall, with skin the color of polished marble and eyes that burned like dying suns. They did not have presidents or prime ministers. They had a king, Voldris. He ruled over 1 trillion souls across 12,000 worlds. To the Valthorians, species like humanity were not peers. They were flora, uninteresting weeds growing on the edge of their manicured universal garden. The incident occurred in the Grand Concourse. Ambassador Hastings, David, and a handful of human aides were waiting to formally present their trade credentials. King Voldris was walking down the center of the hall, flanked by heavily armored royal guards. The king was draped in liquid gold fabrics, his expression one of absolute, suffocating boredom. He wasn't even looking at the delegations he passed. Leo was sitting on a bench near his father, playing with a small mechanical puzzle cube, a gift from an engineer back at Cape Canaveral. The boy dropped it. The cube hit the polished floor and rolled. It rolled directly into the center of the walkway. Leo, acting on pure childhood instinct, darted out to grab it. "Got it," he chirped, scooping up the toy. He didn't look up in time. The boy bumped directly into the shin of King Voldris. The entire concourse went dead silent. The ambient hum of the station seemed to evaporate. Ambassador Hastings froze, his blood instantly turning to ice. David Rourke dropped his datapad, taking a desperate step forward. "Leo, come here," David whispered, his voice trembling. King Voldris stopped. He looked down at the human child. Leo, realizing he was in the way of a very tall, very intimidating alien, took a step back and offered a nervous, apologetic smile. "Sorry, mister." The king did not blink. He did not speak. To him, an insect had just crawled onto his boot. With a fluid, almost lazy motion, Voldris drew a sidearm from his hip, a sleek silver weapon that pulsed with an ugly violet light. He aimed it point-blank at the child's chest. "Wait!" David screamed, lunging forward. Crack. It didn't sound like a gunshot. It sounded like a whip breaking the sound barrier. A blinding flash of violet plasma erupted. Leo didn't even have time to scream. The sheer thermal kinetic energy of the blast threw his small body backward like a ragdoll. He hit the polished floor and did not move. A gaping, cauterized hole smoked in the center of his chest. David hit the floor beside his son a fraction of a second later. He gathered the boy in his arms, his hands frantically pressing against the wound, but there was no blood. The plasma had burned hotter than the sun, instantly vaporizing the boy's heart and lungs. David's mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was a silent, agonizing scream that tore at the very fabric of his soul. He just rocked back and forth, clutching the small, lifeless body. Ambassador Hastings felt his knees buckle, but he forced himself to stand. His hands were shaking so violently he had to grip the seams of his trousers. King Voldris calmly reholstered his weapon. He looked at Hastings, his face entirely devoid of emotion. "Your pet soiled my garments," the king said, his voice echoing through the universal translator collar at his throat. The tone was mildly annoyed. "Nothing more. I expect your government to compensate the ascendancy for the cleaning fee. Remove the carcass before it smells." Valdris stepped over David and the dead child, continuing his walk down the concourse. The Valthorian guards followed, not even glancing at the grieving father. The alien delegations from other worlds watched in hushed murmurs. Some looked pitying, others indifferent. It was the way of the galaxy. The strong did as they pleased. The weak suffered what they must. They fully expected the human ambassador to drop to his knees, apologize profusely, and beg for the king's forgiveness to avoid a planetary bombardment. Hastings did not drop to his knees. He did not speak. He walked over to David, knelt down, placed a hand on the trembling father's shoulder, and gently pulled his own suit jacket off, draping it over Leo's body. Hastings then stood up and looked at the retreating back of King Valdris. There was no diplomatic shouting. There were no empty threats. There was only a terrifying, absolute silence from the humans. Hastings tapped his calm earpiece. "Station Aegis Command, this is the Earth delegation. We are returning to our ship. Withdraw all diplomatic credentials. We are going home." An alien dignitary nearby, an avian creature, clicked its beak in confusion. "Ambassador Hastings, you cannot simply leave. The king requires an apology. Your world could face sanctions. Or worse." Hastings turned to look at the alien. The alien stepped back, visibly startled. The human's eyes, usually warm and diplomatic, were completely hollow. They were the eyes of an apex predator that had just remembered what it was. "There will be no apology," Hastings said quietly. Within the hour, the human transport detached from Station Aegis. As soon as they broke orbit, Hastings sent a single encrypted transmission to the Cheyenne Mountain complex on Earth. It contained the security footage of the concourse, Leo's vital readings dropping to 0, and a 4-word message, Code Black. Protocol Nemesis. The Galactic Council expected a formal protest. They expected weeping human diplomats begging for mediation. A few weeks passed, and the Valthorian ascendancy received nothing. No messages, no trade ships, no frantic pleas for mercy. In fact, the entire Sol system went entirely, perfectly dark. Every human listening post on the edge of the Orion Spur was abandoned. Every human merchant vessel docked at alien ports quietly paid their tabs, fired up their engines, and vanished into warp space. Radio frequencies that normally buzzed with human music, chatter, and navigational beacons fell dead. It was as if humanity had simply ceased to exist. King Valdris laughed it off during a royal banquet. "The apes have locked themselves in their cage," he mused, sipping a glowing blue wine. "Let them cower. When we need their resources, we will simply take them." But deep inside the Cheyenne Mountain complex on Earth, humanity wasn't cowering. They were working. In the subterranean war room, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The footage of Leo's murder had not been released to the public. It was deemed too volatile. If the general population of Earth saw an alien king casually execute a human child, society would tear itself apart in a frenzy for blood. Instead, a heavily redacted version of events was pushed. An unprovoked alien attack on a diplomatic mission had resulted in casualties. That was enough. Secretary of Defense Evelyn Croft stood at the head of the massive holographic table. Across from her stood General Bradley Vance, a hardened veteran of the Pan-Pacific Resource Wars. He had a scar running down his jawline and eyes that looked like chipped flint. Sitting in the corner, staring blankly at a datapad, was David Rourke. He hadn't slept in a week. He looked 20 years older, his face gaunt, his eyes rimmed with angry red. He was no longer a civilian engineer. The United Nations Security Council had reinstated his previous, highly classified, military rank. The Valthorians rely entirely on thermal plasma technology and localized energy shielding. General Vance addressed the room, highlighting a holographic schematic of a Valthorian dreadnought. Their shields are designed to deflect and absorb energy weapons, lasers, plasma, ion blasts. That's how the whole galaxy fights. Elegant, clean, and us? Secretary Croft asked, crossing her arms. We never fully transitioned to energy weapons. Vance replied, a grim, predatory smile touching his lips. We tried, but we found it too expensive. We stuck to our roots. We like throwing rocks. We just got really, really good at throwing them fast. The galaxy had long ago abandoned kinetic weaponry, viewing it as primitive and barbaric. But humanity had spent the last 2 centuries perfecting the art of accelerated mass. The refitting of the fleet is complete, Vance continued. We've taken the dampeners off the railguns. We aren't going to fight a traditional naval battle, Secretary. Their shields will stop a laser beam. Their shields will absolutely not stop a 3-ton depleted uranium slug moving at 4% the speed of light. Croft looked at the map of the Valthorian Ascendancy. 12,000 worlds. Trillions of lives. King Voldris has a standing armada of over 7,000 ships. We have 90 retrofitted dreadnoughts and a handful of destroyers. The math doesn't favor a direct assault. We aren't doing a direct assault. A raspy voice interrupted. The room turned to look at David Rourke. He stood up from his corner, walking into the dim light of the holographic table. He tapped a command onto the console, and the projection shifted from military fleets to logistical supply lines. The Valthorians are a hierarchy, David said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth he used to possess. They don't farm on their core worlds. They don't mine on their core worlds. They rely on vast, unprotected convoys from their outer colonies to feed their populations and fuel their ships. He zoomed in on a massive planetary system known as the Tarsus Belt. This is their primary agricultural hub. 3 billion Valthorians live here, exporting 80% of the food for the royal sector. It is defended by a skeleton crew of planetary guard ships, because no one in the galaxy has the sheer audacity to attack it. You want to disrupt their food supply? Croft asked. No. David looked up. The cold, dead look in his eyes made even the seasoned General Vance shiver. I want to starve his empire to death. I want them to look up at the stars and realize the darkness is looking back. David, Croft said softly, the people on those agricultural worlds, they didn't shoot your son. Neither did the people of Earth, David replied instantly. But King Voldris has already stated that our entire species is liable. In his eyes, we are one collective pest. Let's show him exactly what a plague looks like. General Vance nodded slowly. Protocol Nemesis is authorized. We go dark. We strike from the void. We use kinetic bombardments, and we leave no survivors to report our tactics. By the time Voldris realizes what is happening, half his empire will be bleeding out. 3 days later, the first blow landed. The Valthorian agricultural world of Tarsus Prime was a lush green paradise. Automated harvesters the size of skyscrapers moved across continents of golden wheat. The planetary governor was in the middle of a routine broadcast when the sky suddenly ignited. There were no warp signatures. There were no incoming energy blasts to trigger the early warning alarms. A human stealth dreadnought, the USS Adrian Pendragon, had slipped out of warp space just outside the system's gravity well. Without broadcasting a single frequency, it had aligned its massive spinal railgun with the planet's orbital distribution station. The human gunners didn't fire plasma. They fired a solid titanium tungsten rod, roughly the size of a telephone pole. Because the weapon was purely kinetic, the Valthorian energy shields didn't even register it as a threat. The rod bypassed the shields completely, striking the distribution station at immense velocity. The kinetic impact was equivalent to a tactical nuclear warhead. The entire orbital ring shattered in a blinding flash of silent light, raining millions of tons of burning debris down onto the agricultural continents below. Before the planetary guard could even scramble their fighters, a second human ship dropped out of warp, fired a volley of kinetic missiles at the planet's primary fusion reactors, and vanished back into the void. In less than 12 minutes, the breadbasket of the Valthorian Ascendancy was reduced to burning ash and crippled infrastructure. No demands were made. No flags were flown. Back in his royal palace, King Voldris was woken by his frantic military advisors. The impossible had happened. A core world had been devastated, and they had no idea who did it or how. They didn't know that out in the cold black of space, David Rourke was sitting in the targeting bay of a stealth cruiser, staring at a crumpled mechanical puzzle cube, calmly entering the coordinates for the next world. For 6 agonizing months, the Valthorian Ascendancy bled. It was not a war of grand fleets clashing in cinematic brilliance. It was a slaughter conducted in the absolute, terrifying silence of the void. Humanity had weaponized the dark. The strategy formulated by David Rourke and General Vance was brutally simple: paralyze the logistics, blind the communications, and let the sheer weight of the alien empire crush itself. Earth's retrofitted armada became phantoms. A Valthorian fuel depot in the Orion sector would suddenly vanish, its core punctured by a hypersonic, unguided slug. 3 days later, a massive trade convoy carrying vital medical supplies would find its escort frigates systematically shredded by shrapnel clouds, millions of ball bearings deployed in the ship's paths, moving at orbital velocities. Energy shields designed to repel superheated plasma were completely useless against cold, hard mass. Panic began to rot the Valthorian ascendancy from the inside out. Within the opulent halls of the royal palace on Valthor Prime, King Valdris paced like a caged animal. The liquid gold fabrics he wore seemed heavy now, his dying sun eyes erratic and bloodshot. The ambient temperature of his throne room had been lowered. The energy grids across the capital were rationing power. "How is it possible?" Valdris snarled, slamming his fist onto a crystalline table, shattering it instantly. "They are primates. They have not even mastered basic antimatter containment. Yet my admirals tell me we have lost 40% of our supply lines to rocks." His chief of intelligence, Lord Commander Reginald, bowed his head. "My king, the humans are not fighting a civilized war. They refuse to engage our dreadnoughts. They strike only where we are weak, and they leave no survivors. We are chasing shadows. Then find the source casting the shadow." Valdris roared. "Burn their home world. Incinerate Earth." "We cannot, sire," Reginald replied, his voice trembling. "They have deployed a web of autonomous orbital platforms around their sol system. Our scouts attempted a recon jump. They were obliterated by what the humans call Kasaba howitzers. Nuclear-shaped charges that fire spears of concentrated kinetic force. We cannot get within 10 light-years of Earth without losing the fleet." Valdris slumped into his throne, the reality of his situation finally piercing his god complex. "They are starving us." "Yes, sire. And the outer colonies are already in open rebellion. They blame the crown." Deep in the blackness of space aboard the command deck of the USS Churchill, David Rourke watched the galactic map. The holographic projection was bathed in red markers, each representing a crippled Valthorian world or a destroyed supply chain. David looked terrible, his skin paper-white, his cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass. He survived on nutrient paste and an unrelenting, cold fury. General Vance stepped up beside him, holding a steaming mug of coffee. "Intel from the deep space buoys confirms it. Valdris is consolidating. He's pulling his grand fleet back to the capital system. He's abandoning the colonies to protect his own neck." David didn't blink. He just stared at the glowing blue sphere representing Valthor Prime. "He's scared. But fear isn't enough. We need to break the concept of his divinity. We need him to understand what it feels like to be completely, utterly powerless." "The Grand Fleet has over 4,000 capital ships orbiting his home world," Vance cautioned. "Even with our kinetic bypass, if we jump into that gravity well, the sheer volume of their plasma batteries will melt our stealth ships to slag." "We aren't going to fight the Grand Fleet," David said softly, his fingers flying across the console. He brought up a schematic of Valthor Prime's solar system. It had 2 moons. One was a small rocky satellite. The other, known as Era, was massive, roughly the size of Mars, holding a highly unstable tectonic core. "General," David said, pointing to the larger moon, "I need you to authorize the deployment of the Goliath payload." Vance's breath hitched. The Goliath payload wasn't just a kinetic rod. It was a classified project, a solid cylinder of superdense osmium equipped with a localized gravity drive meant to accelerate the mass to a fraction of light speed right before impact. It was a planet cracker. "David, if we hit that moon with Goliath, the tectonic shockwave will shatter it. The resulting debris ring will bombard Valthor Prime. It will be an extinction-level event. Billions of civilians will die." David finally looked away from the console, meeting Vance's eyes. The grief in the engineer's gaze was an endless, lightless ocean. "I am not going to kill billions of civilians, General. I am not King Valdris. I don't shoot children." He tapped a sequence on the screen, altering the firing trajectory. "We aren't going to hit Era. We're going to hit the dead moon, the small one. It sits directly in the orbital path of their grand fleet." Vance looked at the new trajectory, his eyes widening as he realized the sheer, unadulterated madness of the plan. "My God, you're going to turn the moon into a shotgun." The Valthorian Grand Fleet was a marvel of the galaxy. Over 4,000 ships of polished white hull plating and pulsing violet energy fields, arranged in perfect symmetrical defense formations around Valthor Prime. King Voldris watched them from the grand balcony of his palace, finding hollow comfort in their numbers. The humans were cowards. They would never dare strike the heart of the Ascendancy. He was wrong. Space did not tear open with the familiar glowing portals of a standard warp jump. Instead, the void simply seemed to ripple. Just outside the planetary defense grid, a single human ship decloaked. It was the USS Adrian Pendragon. It did not power up weapons. It did not raise shields. It simply sat there, broadcasting a single unencrypted radio frequency across all channels. "We are humanity, and we are no longer asking for an apology." Aboard the flagship of the Grand Fleet, Admiral Reginald scoffed. "A single ship. They have lost their minds. All batteries, lock onto the human vessel. Vaporize them." Before the order could be executed, the proximity alarms on the Valthorian flagship screamed. "Admiral!" a sensor officer yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "Massive energy spike detected outside the system. Incoming projectile. Speed is, by the gods, speed is 0.08 light speed." There was no time to react. There was no time to brace. The Goliath payload, accelerating through the void like the wrath of a vengeful god, bypassed the Grand Fleet entirely. It slammed into the small, dead moon orbiting Valthor Prime. The impact was beyond cataclysmic. The osmium cylinder struck the lunar surface with the force of 10 million megatons of TNT. In absolute silence, the entire moon simply shattered. It didn't explode into dust, it fractured into millions of jagged, continent-sized fragments of rock. And because of the sheer kinetic transfer of the Goliath payload, those millions of fragments were propelled forward directly into the orbital path of the Valthorian Grand Fleet. It was a slaughter. Energy shields flared brilliantly as they tried to absorb the impact of mountain-sized boulders moving at hypersonic speeds, but the shields overloaded in seconds. Dreadnoughts were snapped in half. Cruisers were crushed like tin cans beneath the relentless, unstoppable wave of lunar shrapnel. The sky above Valthor Prime lit up with 1,000 silent explosions as the pride of the alien empire was reduced to a swirling ring of burning wreckage. In less than 3 minutes, the Valthorian Grand Fleet ceased to exist. King Voldris fell to his knees on his balcony, the violet flashes of his dying armada reflecting in his wide, terrified eyes. The shockwave of the destruction painted the sky in streaks of fire. He was defenseless. Moments later, the sky darkened. 90 human dreadnoughts, having slipped through the chaos of the debris field, dropped out of stealth directly into the low atmosphere of Valthor Prime. They cast massive, terrifying shadows over the royal city. Their weapons were not aimed at military bases or defense turrets. Every single railgun, every missile battery, every targeting laser was pointed directly at the royal palace. A heavy metallic thud echoed through the grand halls as human drop pods smashed through the palace's vaulted glass ceilings. Valthorian royal guards, elite warriors trained for centuries, raised their plasma rifles. They were cut down in seconds by heavy, suppressed ballistic fire from human special forces wearing exoskeleton armor. The doors to the throne room were blown completely off their hinges. Dust and smoke billowed into the immaculate chamber. King Voldris sat on his throne, his hands shaking, his golden robes covered in the dust of his shattered palace. He tried to project an air of majesty, but he looked small. He looked mortal. From the smoke, 2 figures emerged. General Bradley Vance, his assault rifle resting casually against his chest, and David Rourke. David was unarmed. He wore a simple, unadorned black suit. He walked slowly up the crystal steps toward the throne, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. Voldris stared at the human. He recognized him. It was the father of the insect he had exterminated on Station Aegis. "You," Voldris whispered, his voice trembling. "You destroyed my empire. For a single insignificant life." David stopped at the base of the throne. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, charred mechanical puzzle cube. He placed it gently on the edge of the king's armrest. "He wasn't insignificant," David said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "He was my universe. And because you took him from me, I decided to take yours." "Are you here to kill me, human?" Valdris sneered, trying to muster a final scrap of defiance. "Do it. Make me a martyr. My people will rise." David shook his head. "No. If I kill you, you escape the consequences of your actions. You are going to live, Valdris. But you are going to live as a beggar." General Vance stepped forward, pulling a heavy metallic collar from his belt. "Under the authority of the United Nations of Earth, the Valthorian ascendancy is hereby dissolved. Your core worlds are under martial quarantine. Your shipyards are our property. If a single Valthorian vessel attempts to build a military-grade weapon, we will drop a kinetic rod on your capital." Vance tossed the collar at the king's feet. "Put it on. It's a translator and a tracker. You are going to walk out onto that balcony, and you are going to broadcast your unconditional surrender to the entire galaxy. You are going to tell them that humanity holds the leash now." Valdris looked at the collar, then at the sky outside, filled with the looming, silent shapes of human warships. He was a god-king. He had ruled 1,000,000,000,000 souls. And he had lost everything because he couldn't be bothered to look down. Slowly, his hands shaking, Valdris picked up the collar and fastened it around his neck. David turned his back on the broken king and began to walk away. The galaxy had thought humanity was weak because they did not use elegant weapons or speak in grand philosophical overtures. They had mistaken our lack of aggression for a lack of capability. They would never make that mistake again. Humanity had not come to the stars to conquer. But as David walked out of the ruined palace, looking up at the sky filled with the iron might of Earth, the message to the universe was clear. "We are here. We want peace. But if you touch our children, there is no place in the dark where you can hide." The universe learned a terrifying lesson that day. True power isn't a crown of gold. It's the quiet resolve of a grieving father and a species that weaponized the void. The broadcast was watched by every corner of the galaxy. King Valdris stood on his shattered balcony, the metallic collar gleaming around his neck, his golden robes torn and dust-covered. Behind him, the burning wrecks of his grand fleet still rained debris across the sky. His voice, once capable of commanding trillions, cracked as he read the words that David Rourke had placed in front of him. "I, King Valdris of the Valthorian Ascendancy, do hereby surrender unconditionally to the United Nations of Earth. My empire is dissolved. My fleets are destroyed. My worlds are under the protection and the authority of humanity. I acted with cruelty. I took a child's life without thought. The galaxy now knows the cost of such arrogance. Let no ruler forget what happened here. Humanity does not forgive. Humanity does not forget. But they have chosen to let me live as a reminder." He stepped back from the podium. The transmission ended. Across the galaxy, 100 billion beings stared at their screens in stunned silence. The unthinkable had happened. A young species, dismissed as primitive, had just brought the mightiest empire in known space to its knees. Not with diplomacy. Not with alliances. With pure, calculated, terrifying efficiency. In the weeks that followed, the Valthorian ascendancy collapsed. Not because humanity destroyed it, because the Valthorians themselves lost faith. The outer colonies, once kept in line by fear of the royal fleet, declared independence. The military, humiliated and leaderless, fractured into rival factions. The royal family, stripped of its power, vanished into obscurity. Humanity did not claim the empire's territory. They did not install puppet governments. They did not demand tribute. The 90 dreadnoughts that had hovered over Valthor Prime simply left. They returned to the dark, silent void from which they had come. The galaxy was baffled. The other empires, watching from a safe distance, had expected Earth to seize the moment, to become the new superpower. Instead, humanity retreated. They had proven their capability. They had no interest in proving their dominance. General Vance summarized it during a rare press conference. "We didn't go to war to conquer. We went to war because a child was murdered. That debt is paid. "We're going home." But David Rourke did not go home. Not immediately. After the surrender, he stood alone on the observation deck of the USS Churchill, staring at the ruins of Valthor Prime through the viewport. General Vance found him there, hours later, still holding the charred puzzle cube. "It's over," Vance said quietly. David shook his head. "It will never be over. Not for me. You could have killed him. On that throne you had every right. Why didn't you?" David was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Because Leo would have asked me not to. He was a good kid. Better than me. Better than any of us." Vance placed a hand on his shoulder. "What will you do now?" David looked out at the stars, the same stars that had witnessed his son's murder, his species' fury, and an empire's fall. "I'm going to build something," he said. "Something that ensures no child ever has to be afraid of the dark again." Years passed. The Valthorian ascendancy was replaced by a loose coalition of independent systems, each governed by its own people. Earth became known not as a conqueror, but as a guardian. The orbital defense platforms remained in place. The stealth fleet remained ready. But humanity focused on what it did best: building, exploring, and reaching out to other young species who were just finding their way among the stars. David Rourke founded the Horizon Initiative, an organization dedicated to providing security and support to fledgling civilizations threatened by larger powers. He never remarried. He never had another child. But he visited elementary schools across Earth, speaking to classrooms of wide-eyed students. "Be brave," he would tell them. "Be kind. And never, ever let anyone make you feel small. Because you're not. None of you are." He always carried a small, faded puzzle cube in his pocket. He never showed it. But he touched it before every speech. One evening, years later, a package arrived at his home in Colorado. It was from an address he didn't recognize. Inside was a child's drawing, a crayon sketch of a man in a black suit standing in front of a starry sky, holding the hand of a small boy. The caption read, "Thank you for keeping us safe." David held the drawing for a long time. Then he pinned it to the wall of his office, next to a faded photograph of a bright-eyed, smiling boy who never got to grow up. The stars outside his window were the same stars that had witnessed everything. But they didn't seem so cold anymore. They seemed like they were watching over him, too. He finished his coffee, touched the puzzle cube in his pocket, and went back to work. The dark was still out there. But humanity had proven that the dark could be fought. And that was enough. That was everything. 10 years after the fall of the Valthorian ascendancy, the Galactic Council convened for a historic session. For the first time, Earth was granted a permanent seat, not as an observer, not as a junior partner, but as a full member with veto power. Ambassador Adrian Hastings, now gray-haired and slower in his movements, accepted the seat on behalf of humanity. His acceptance speech was 3 words long. "We accept your fear." The chamber did not applaud. They understood. Humanity had not come seeking approval. They had come to ensure that no child would ever die again because an emperor was bored. King Voldris lived. He spent his remaining years in a modest apartment on a neutral station, stripped of his wealth, his power, and his dignity. He worked menial jobs. He ate recycled food. He was recognized everywhere he went, not as a king, but as a warning. The collar remained around his neck, a silent reminder that the universe had changed. He died alone, 17 years after his surrender. His last words, recorded by the collar's automatic log, were, "I should have looked down." David Rourke never returned to the public eye. The Horizon Initiative grew into the galaxy's most respected humanitarian organization, operating in over 3,000 systems. But David himself faded into legend. Some said he died. Others said he was still out there, watching, waiting. On the 20th anniversary of Leo's death, a small memorial was built in a quiet park in Colorado. It was not a grand monument. It was a simple stone bench, overlooking a field of wildflowers. Engraved on the bench were the words, "He was not insignificant. He was a universe." Visitors came from across the galaxy. Valthorians, freed from their emperor's tyranny, left flowers. Humans left puzzle cubes. Children left drawings. And every year on that day, a single unmarked stealth ship would appear in orbit, hang silently for 1 hour, and then disappear. No one knew who piloted it. No one needed to. The galaxy did not become a perfect place. Empires still rose. Conflicts still erupted. But the old arrogance, the belief that power meant the right to do anything, had been shattered. Young species were given a chance to grow. Old species learned to listen. And at the center of it all, Earth remained, quiet, watchful, unyielding. Humanity had not wanted to be the galaxy's police. They had not wanted to be the galaxy's judge. But they had accepted the role, because no one else would. We are here. We want peace. But if you touch our children, there is no place in the dark where you can hide. The message was carved into the entrance of the new Galactic Council building. It was the first thing every delegate saw. It was the last thing every tyrant remembered. David Rourke died on a Tuesday, exactly 25 years after his son. He was found in his small home in Colorado, seated in a chair facing the window, looking out at the stars. In his hand was a small, faded puzzle cube. On his desk was a photograph of a bright-eyed boy. He had no family to claim his belongings. But the Horizon Initiative placed his ashes in a small capsule and launched it into space, toward the constellation that held Station Aegis. The capsule's inscription read, "He turned his grief into a shield. May he find the peace he gave to others." The stars watched it drift. And somewhere, in a field of wildflowers, a child's laughter echoed in the wind. The universe had learned a terrifying lesson. But it had also learned something else. Something about mercy. Something about justice. Something about the quiet, unbreakable resolve of a species that had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. Humanity had not come to conquer the galaxy. They had come to remind it what it meant to be alive. And that, in the end, was the most terrifying thing of all. 30 years after the fall of the Valthorian ascendancy, a young woman stood at the memorial bench in Colorado. Her name was Elara Vance, granddaughter of General Bradley Vance. She had grown up on stories of the war, of the stealth fleet, of the man who had turned grief into a weapon. But she had never met David Rourke. He had died before she was born. She knelt and placed a small puzzle cube on the bench. It was new, brightly colored, unlike the faded one in the photographs. Beside it, she placed a handwritten letter. "Dear David," she wrote, "I don't know if you can read this, but I wanted you to know, I became an ambassador. Not for Earth, for the Horizon Initiative. I've spent 5 years helping young species defend themselves against bullies. I think about you every time I negotiate a ceasefire or broker a treaty. You taught us that strength isn't about destroying enemies. It's about protecting the innocent. Thank you. I'll never forget Leo. None of us will." She stood up, looked at the stars, and smiled. The galaxy had changed. Not because humanity had conquered it, because humanity had inspired it. Empires that once ruled through fear now ruled through cooperation. Wars that once ended in genocide now ended in mediation. And the dark void that had once seemed so cold and empty now seemed full of possibility. Elara walked away from the bench, back toward her waiting transport. Behind her, the wildflowers swayed in the wind. Somewhere overhead, a stealth ship hummed silently in orbit, a tradition carried on by pilots who never revealed their names. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The memorial would be there tomorrow. And the next day. And forever. Because some things were worth remembering. Not the violence. Not the revenge. The love. On the edge of the galaxy, at the far reach of human exploration, a new generation of children played in the fields of a colony world. They were human and Valthorian and a dozen other species, all together. They laughed. They chased each other. They dropped toys and picked them up without fear. Their parents watched from the porches of their homes, coffee in hand, eyes on the sky. The sky was full of stars. And in the dark between them, humanity kept its watch. Not with weapons. With hope. The universe had learned. The universe had grown. And somewhere, in a small house in Colorado, a faded puzzle cube sat on a windowsill, catching the light of a setting sun. It had been 30 years. The grief had not faded, but it had transformed into something beautiful, into something eternal, into something worth fighting for. The end was not an ending. It was a beginning. And that, David Rourke would have said, was exactly what Leo would have wanted. A universe where no child had to be afraid. A universe where love was stronger than vengeance. A universe where humanity, small, stubborn, impossible humanity, had finally found its place. Not as conquerors. As guardians. The stars watched. The galaxy turned. And the memorial bench stood silent, surrounded by flowers and puzzle cubes and the quiet footsteps of those who remembered. He was not insignificant. He was a universe. And universes never truly die. They just change shape, so that new stars could be born.